Суда такого высокого ледового класса имеют для нас стратегическое значение по укреплению статуса России как великой арктической державы.
No one denies Russia has significant Arctic interests. The U.S. has a long contested feud with Canada over sovereign claims to the Northwest Passage.
The Northwest Passage is Canadian waters, period.
当前北极正迎来难得的发展机遇，中国是近北极国家，这不仅是
You likely don't think much about Canada's Arctic, but the truth is, you should. For the first time in human history, an ocean which has been largely unusable is now revealing itself to the world. The opening of the Arctic will have profound consequences on the future of our country. For one, Canada will find itself at the center of new and critical trade routes. These trade routes have the power to reshape global trade as we know it. And two, more importantly, as Canada's enemies militarize their Arctic presence, Canada's own backyard may be turned into an arena of war. We can either rise to this monumental occasion or maintain our current path of inaction and seeming indifference to this civilization-changing shift and pay the consequences. Well, to figure out what is really going on, we're now joined by one of Canada's leading Arctic defense experts. He's a professor at the University of Calgary and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Professor Robert Huebert. Professor, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Harrison.
So I first want to have you outline the vulnerability of Canada in the Arctic right now. We've read reports that Canada's Arctic icebreaker fleet are unable to patrol the high north in the winter, and that our satellites are unable to get a full picture on who's entering our Arctic territory. And this is to say nothing at all over the fact that it appears no one is actually signing up for the military to help defend this country. Now, in my opinion, that's a bad mixture. But what is the situation right now? How bad is it in the Arctic for Canada?
Well, it's bad and it's getting worse. I mean, you're making reference to the Auditor General's report that just laid bare about, despite government propaganda, and it is propaganda because they keep saying everything is well in hand. In fact, things are not well in hand in terms of our surveillance capability. We saw quite clearly with the many HAPs and balloons and other Chinese efforts to basically set up surveillance systems in and around the Canadian Arctic that we are not prepared for it, even though experts have been warning of this problem coming. And so we've had a security threat in the Arctic since the beginning of the Cold War. And people tend to forget this, but the reality is that the whole nuclear deterrent, the whole effort to hold the Soviet Union from being able to take aggressive action in Europe or even go to nuclear war, depended on us actually pulling our weight in the Arctic. And in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, one could argue that we did. And then when we started getting into the 1980s, we basically said the Cold War was over. We'll never have to worry about security in the Arctic. And we basically stopped doing anything. We upgraded the North Warning System, which was the DEW line, which was central for any type of surveillance system. The last time that we gave it a meaningful upgrade was in 1985, when we converted it from the DEW line. We gave new technologies, and that was it. You make mention of the icebreaker. The last time that we built a large icebreaker was in 1969, and that's how long that the Louis Saint Laurent has been in service. Now, the one bright side in all of this is that we are in the process of having 6 offshore Arctic patrol vessels that have some capability of going into ice. In fact, they're performing better than what people were expecting them to do. So that is something forward. But we have absolutely no capability in terms of underwater detection. And this, of course, is as we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, as we're seeing in terms of reports of Chinese capabilities. Not having any capability of having any surveillance for an underwater a threat is, of course, ludicrous, given the fact that we see clear and present dangers in this particular context. Now, the other aspect that falls into this is all ties to traditional security. This is, of course, trying to stay aware of what our enemies in the north, and let's be blunt, it is the Russians and the Chinese that we have to be the most focused on in this regards. But at the same time, we are also doing a lot of lip service when it comes to the environmental security issues that are coming forward. And we pat ourselves on the back on trying to be, do things green. But there are very large suggestions that unless you can get the Chinese and the Russians on board, and of course you've got that geopolitical threat going on, that they're not going to listen on this, that we have even further problems coming forward with how we try to figure out how to respond in that context. One of the things that we're seeing with climate change, and it is a very clear and present danger, is, of course, we're seeing all sorts of new requirements of what I guess you could call human security. It's the forest fires. It's a constabulary. It's not the nuclear missiles that, of course, that are designed to fly over the Arctic region, that, by the way, are being expanded by everybody, Americans, Chinese, Russians, and is making a very changed nuclear environment for Canada. And again, we're not paying attention to that either. But also on the ability to respond to flooding, to the fires, to the effects that climate change, of course, is having on the local communities. And again, we get back to your original point about the incapabilities and the fact that our forces have been allowed to run down to numbers that are very difficult to respond. So in a nutshell, if you want to talk about security threats to Canada, you can go from the human security issues. And of course, we also have to remember in terms of the fact that we have some of the largest social problems in the North in terms of education, health, and all types of human security crises that we are talking about, high suicide rates. So we have the human security dilemma that doesn't seem to be solvable in terms of the fact that the numbers get worse rather than better. We have the climate change, and we're seeing clearly with the forest fires and the flooding how real this is and how much it's impacting. And we have a geopolitical environment where we see the Americans in the process of completely rebuilding their nuclear forces. We see the Russians talking about the use of nuclear weapons in a war environment, and we have to remind ourselves that the vast majority of Russian capabilities are in the north. And we have China that had sat for the longest time at 300 nuclear weapons. They are now up to 500 nuclear weapons. They are going probably to catch the Americans by the end of the decade. And they're developing delivery systems that clearly will have a capability to at least be near or even in the Arctic. Not to attack the Arctic. Let's be very clear. It's not about that. It is about launching from where they think that they can then, of course, try to bring pressure on the Americans in the event of, say, a war in Taiwan, South Korea, or any other locations that people are talking about in this context. And so you want to talk about insecurity threats in the Arctic? Every single type that you can name is in the Arctic as we speak.
I want to play a clip for the audience of Chief of the Defense Staff General Wayne Eyre talking about his concern about Canada's military readiness to deploy and operate in the Arctic, saying he's very concerned about that.
The first part really speaks to readiness, which has got me very concerned. And readiness has four components: the people, the equipment, the training, and the sustainment. And we need to focus on all four of those to be able to conduct operations in the Arctic. We've got to have the right people. And so, yeah, you've heard lots of commentary about the people situation in the Canadian Armed Forces. This is something that I am extremely concerned about.
And as well, we've recently seen a video from the Vice Admiral of the Canadian Navy talking about how even though there are two of the yet-to-be 6 icebreaker patrol Harry DeWolf class ships, the military, the Navy can't operate both at the same time, and yet we're expected to have 4 more. How has the government allowed this to happen, where clearly the threat to the Arctic is there? It's one of the clearest threats to Canada, yet we can't even seem to operate what we have in the first place.
Well, part of the problem, I mean, of course, the politicians are the ones that are failing to act, and this government has been at the lead of that particular parade. But part of the problem that we face is that the attention of Canadians is elsewhere. We say we're an Arctic nation, and we have the North in our national anthem. But the reality is we look southward. We have other issues that we are always more attentive. We're more concerned about economics in terms of housing, in terms of jobs. We were obviously more concerned when the pandemic hit. And so there isn't a sense within the Canadian public that this is something that we need to be spending the resources that are required. And in fact, we've been brought up in this field, this mythology that, well, don't worry, the Americans ultimately will take care of any true security problem that we face. And as a result, even though the government, to its credit, when it launched its defense policy back in 2017, Strong, Secure, and Engage, they actually noted that we needed to, of course, respond to Arctic capabilities. They talked about NORAD modernization. They talked about the need to work with the NATO allies, something that we haven't done before in the past. So there was the recognition and there was the talk that we had to do it, but that was 2017. Here we are in 2024, and we have, of course, the head of the Canadian Navy, the head of the Canadian Forces overall saying, hey, nothing has really been done despite their best efforts. I can assure you that our military leadership has been trying very hard, at least in the last 6 or 7 years, to try to remedy many of these problems. And this is a change even amongst the military. I mean, the military itself used to joke that if the Russians ever were to invade us, their biggest concern would be how would they rescue the Russians? Ha, ha, ha. First of all, they weren't going to be doing it on a land invasion, but, you know, it was a bit of a red herring that was deliberately put forward to basically say to Canadians, hey, don't worry, there's not a threat here. And so, you know, previous heads of the Chief Defense Staff, and it was the Chief of Defense Staffs that made those awful jokes and assessments, are also part of the problem in that they downplayed in the past, even though there were many people saying that, no, this threat is developing. I mean, this threat really starts developing as soon as we see Putin coming to power in 2000. And we can see that in the weapon capabilities that he develops, the fact that he uses military force and so forth. So in other words, it shouldn't be a big surprise. But because we have downplayed it, the narrative has always been that the softer security issues are the real threat. They are a threat. I don't want to undermine, you know, in terms of what is happening to the communities. I don't want to undermine in terms of what is happening in terms of environmental securities. These are existential threats to the security of Northern Canadians and to Canadians. But it seems as if we can't chew gum and walk at the same time. And so like we've had this narrative for a very long time of what is often referred to as Arctic exceptionalism. The idea that, no, the Arctic is not a threat. We don't have to worry about it. Therefore, we don't have to do anything about it. And so as a result, Canadians have been told, hey, you know, security and Arctic sovereignty are well in hand. We don't really have to do anything. And that has allowed governments, both conservative and liberal governments, though the conservatives need credit for getting the Arctic offshore patrol vessels. And just a minor little correct, they're not icebreakers. They do not have icebreaking capability, though they go through ice fairly well. In other words, it's one of those gray areas, just to be a little bit technically nerdy on it. But nevertheless, outside of that, we really don't have anything. We are so far behind on having any type of submarine capabilities. We're still trying to even have the conversation about that. The F-35s only reluctantly were brought in by this government to replace the F-18s. And remember, we got the F-18s in 1981. I dare say, I don't think that you were even born in 1981. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of just how old these aircraft are. And so the fact that we have both a government and, you know, if I'm being honest, a military, and I'd say amongst many of my colleagues saying, hey, there's no threat, Canadians. We need to focus on the social issues. And again, they're right on that. We do need to focus on that. We need to address the fact that suicide rates amongst Northern Indigenous young people is so high within this region, and the awful drug and other problems that we see within the North. We know that there's economic crises, that the way of living and education is problematic. Once again, not denying it, but we have this inability to say, yes, we have to deal with the human security issues that are there, but we also have to be able to deal with this growing threat that we can identify. I mean, Putin makes it clear that he's going to use force as soon as he comes into power. As soon as he comes into power, what does he do? He uses military force to put down the Chechnya Revolution. And then in 2008, when Georgia starts talking about joining NATO, he basically shows again, no, you can't join NATO, and I will use military force against you. In that 8-year war or 8-day war, that there were real problems with the Russian military, but they ultimately persevered. And remember, the Ukrainian war doesn't start in 2022. We have this mythology in Canada. So for some reason, well, not for some reason, it fits within the narrative that don't worry, be happy. There's not a real threat out there. But remember, the war doesn't start in 2022. It starts in 2014. when Russia invades, uses military force, kills Ukrainians, and seizes Crimea, and then also seizes part of the eastern Ukraine, where it's been an ongoing simmering war from that point in time. 2022 is where they really escalated. So again, we have this mythology in Canada. First of all, the international threat was, international environment was not dangerous. And second of all, even if it was dangerous, the Americans will take care of it. And as a result, we've been willing to let the Canadian forces basically get to the point where we have the general airs and general, not general, the admiral in charge of the Navy saying we can't do things now because they've been allowed to be so problematic. So it's politicians, full stop, and this government in particular. But then again, it's the narrative that we within the, have been feeding Canadians. No, there's not a threat, so don't worry about it. And I think that was just wrong.
If there really are, limited resources, financial resources for this country to put to use in the Arctic, then wouldn't it make sense that Canada would scale back what we're sending overseas, whether it be not just to Ukraine, but in foreign aid as well, to actually defending our own territory against Russia? See, to me, that's what I'm not really understanding from what we hear from the government, that there are limited resources. We're not able to defund our Arctic defense when we have these other requirements. But if Russia is the main aggressor here and we technically share an ocean border with Russia, shouldn't that money that we send away go to Canada's defense in the Arctic?
Well, Harrison, there's two answers to your very, very astute question here. The first one is the reality is that Russia, that is the major threat, as you point out. They have the nuclear capabilities. They are the ones that are being aggressive on all fronts. They've had a GDP roughly the same size as Canada throughout this entire period. Now, it varies some years, but if we're talking about from the year 2000 to 2024, this period that we see Russia redeveloping as a clear security threat to the West, their GDP, so it's not a question that we can't do it. It's a question that we made certain political decisions. Now, obviously, our social system, our where the government has put its priorities for spending is very different from what the Russian government is. And I would, if truth be told, I'd rather be living in Canada than Russia any day. And that's a reflection of the fact that I think that we've got an amazing society and that the decisions on a whole are correct. But Russia, with a GDP roughly the size of Canada, has had a defense budget of $60 billion per year. They're usually third or fourth. The U.S. is first always with about 600 to 700 billion. The Chinese are catching the Americans. They're up to about 400 billion, though it's hard always to get a really good number because of the authoritative nature of the regime. And then for fourth place, it's always been Saudi Arabia or Russia. Those are the two that, on any given year. That is a political decision. And so you say, okay, well, should Canada, Canada does have the resources. Well, no, Canada does have the resources. We've just made decisions not to spend. Now you say, okay, well, that's fair. But we're now in a new environment since 2014, and 2022 is when, of course, Deputy Prime Minister Freeman said the world changed in February 2022 when the Russians upped their invasion. Means to me she wasn't paying attention to what the Russians were doing before. And that's hard to believe because she is an outstanding Russian expert, but I mean, is she speaking as the expert or as the politician? Nevertheless, so, okay, things change in 2022 and you say, okay, well, maybe we should be focusing on keeping our capabilities at home. Yeah, we should be doing that. We should be developing that capability. It's not keeping them at home, it's actually developing it because we need the F-35s. But we need the F-35s and the few refuelers that go with it and the satellite system and the ability to work with our allies because an F-35 is a very different, people think in terms, they go to Top Gun movies and say, oh, it's a fighter just like World War II. No, it's not. I mean, those are mythologies. These are systems of systems. But to learn how to do that, you got to be with your friends and allies. And guess what? That's over in Europe. And so the threat of Russia and the threat of China is fungible. In other words, yeah, we can say, okay, well, we're going to go home and just look after the Arctic, when in fact, what we're talking about is ultimately the threat is going to be much greater than that. So yeah, we need to be doing stuff in the Arctic, but we also need to be learning how to do it overseas, trying to keep the Russians and the Chinese as far away from us as possible. And so, we have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time, because we've got to do both of them if we were really going to be meeting this threat and meeting it in a meaningful way with our friends and allies.
I want to now talk about China, clearly one of Canada's biggest adversaries. I consider them to be an enemy of Canada, and I think many would agree. In 2019, the special representative to the foreign minister in China declared China to be a near Arctic state. They clearly have ambitions to dominate the Arctic Ocean as a trading route in the years to come. And we also know now that they are building these icebreakers with submersibles, manned and unmanned submersibles, able to go to the Arctic sea floor. I'm no expert in trade, but I'm just assuming that these submersibles aren't going to be used to transport goods, probably something else. Explain what China is trying to do in the Arctic and how this is going to impact the future of Canada.
Yeah, the Chinese in the Arctic, that's a complicated topic because, of course, what the Chinese are pursuing, they have 5 major objectives within the Arctic. The first one is, of course, is they want to be functioning in the overall governance system, and so that they want to be a player in the Arctic Council. They want to be involved in any treaty that might have an impact on them, such as the High Sea Arctic Fishing Treaty, which they are in fact party to. They want to ensure that their voice is heard, which is quite interesting given the fact that they don't want anyone else's voice being heard in the South China Sea. But, these are the paradoxes that many people have already noticed. They want the economics, and there's no question whatsoever that they see the Arctic as a potential shipping route. Now, the focus for the Chinese, if truth is told, it's really on the Northern Sea route. So they're looking more so, not so much on the North American side, but how do they get their goods and services to Russia and get oil back? Because that's the major trading point for when we brought the sanctions against the Russians. When they initiated the war against Ukraine in 2014, because remember, that's when the sanction regime does begin. So they want to take advantage of that, but to get the oil is pipeline shipping, other things, and then they have to ship over to that location. And it's also part of their efforts to become an international maritime trading nation. They know that that is the way that you become the hegemon. They saw the British do it and they saw the Americans do it, and they're trying to copy that in terms of their overall position within the international system. The Arctic becomes a part of it. See the word part of it. Now, so we've got governance, we have economics, we have science. They understand that climate change is affecting them in severe ways. Coastal rising of sea level rises, the desert in the central China region. In other words, they have very real scientific requirements to understand that, and you need to be in the Arctic to be able to do that. And so that's another avenue of action. They also want to be cooperating. In other words, remember, if you're going to be a hegemon, if you want to be the leader, you want to have other people listening. And so that is sort of related to governance, but it goes beyond just simply being part of it. The part that, of course, that you're alluding to is they also see the Arctic as a strategic environment. Now, do they want to dominate? I don't think that anywhere that we can see any clear evidence that they're trying to have the capability of dominating, but they want to be disruptors. They want to have a capability. If they're going to be moving into Taiwan or supporting the North Koreans into South Korea, they want to be able to ensure that the Americans have no safe sanctuaries. Because, I mean, for the Americans, the ability to control the North, the Arctic region is of critical strategic importance. It's important for their submarines. It's important for their satellites. Their nuclear deterrent is based on Arctic capabilities. They need to be able to fire their missiles over the Arctic into Russia to deter the Russians from firing in the first place. Remember, it's that paradox of nuclear deterrence. You want to convince your enemy that you will die with them, but it's only that knowledge that prevents them from being utilized. So for the Americans, the Arctic region is of critical strategic importance. For the Russians, for everything I've just said, the Arctic is of strategic critical importance. For China, China doesn't have to be there, but man, if it's trying to play the long game, if it's trying to make sure that the United States and both Russia know that they have to dedicate scarce resources just because the Chinese have demonstrated they could be there. They're definitely there with their 2 icebreakers, and you make reference to the 3rd icebreaker that they are about to start construction. That is going to have these deep diving submersibles, and the deep diving submersibles are for basically what we suspect will be utilized for. In a strategic environment, you can use them to cut cables. You can use them to basically start listening into cables. And you can use them to deploy SOSAs, or underwater listening capabilities, which we know the Chinese have. They publicly come forward and say, yes, we have these portable underwater listening devices. We're only using it for science, by the way, but we know that they're using them for submarines. And so for the Chinese, it's to keep the Americans off guard. It's to let the Russians know that they can't take the Chinese for granted. I don't think they're going to have an overall presence in the Arctic, but they're going to be in the type of situation that their submarines could be in the Arctic, could be utilized to go into the Arctic to launch hypersonic cruise missiles. That's another targeting issue then that the Americans have to spread out their resources to meet. And so it's a smart strategic move. It's not a critical focus, but again, it disrupts the ability of the Americans and the Russians in the long term to do good strategic planning, and it forces both the Americans and the Russians, therefore, to be always looking over their shoulder. And again, strategically, a very brilliant move, but once again, we have to be careful about going into hyperbole, but in the new environment, that is critically important to understand.
So I want to just bring the conversation back to Canadian territory, Canadian sovereignty, and to talk more about the Northwest Passage. In 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that Canada's claim to the Northwest Passage is illegitimate. And in 2022, Trudeau reaffirmed Canada's position on the Northwest Passage as internal waters. You'll have to forgive my ignorance, but when I look at a map, I see Canadian territory on either side of the Northwest Passage and assume that means it's internal waters. How can anyone claim that this is some sort of international strait?
Well, here's the kicker. It's not just the Americans. In fact, the only country that really has said that the Canadian claim that these are all internal waters has made something, and it's not a complete fit, were the Soviets. The Soviets, because they use similar international legal arguments as what we do in terms of trying to say that these are internal waters. What Canada says is that we, because of historical realities and because no one has used these for shipping routes without Canadian permission, except for 2 times, and we'll come back to that in a moment, means that we can then have always sort of de facto had our limits around the outer limits of the land. So if you look at the archipelago, you can see it's sort of like, okay, it's an archipelago, and you draw the lines around it. Technically, they're called straight baselines in international legal terms. The argumentation that Canada has always had, because historically no one has countered us on that, is that ultimately that means these are internal waters. These are like Lake Winnipeg. If you want to come into them, you have to ask Canadian permission. You have to follow Canadian law. Now, here's the kicker. The Americans, and we can add the European Union, the British, Poland, Italy, France, Japan, I know I'm leaving out a few others, have come forward and said, sorry, we, in different ways, they've used different, it's international terminology and niceties, but they've all said in no uncertain terms, we're not accepting that. The Americans are the loudest, and the Americans, and this is the irony, the Americans would prefer us to have control over the Arctic, because if it's an international strait, it means all shipping can go through without permission. And furthermore, if you are a submarine, you can do so submerged. So they don't want the Soviet/Russian. They don't want the Chinese submarines coming forward. So the Americans have always understood the game, which is they got to say in loud terms, yes, this is an international strait, but in very quiet terms, Canada, how do we manage this? And we actually have had an agreement since 1988 to allow us to do that, and it's been followed. It's not an official treaty, but it's an agreement. The Americans will always ask our consent. It's not permission, and there's a difference in international law, but nobody ever notices it unless you're an international expert. So they ask our consent, and we give it automatically for their icebreakers. And so and what's secret is, of course, we have these secret agreements with the Russians under NORAD, well, we think it's NORAD. We're not entirely certain, for submarines. And I mean, so we get to work with the Americans. We basically, the Americans don't push the issue. Now, this changed with the Trump administration, as so many things did. The Trump administration, which of course, many people question their ability to understand anything in terms of the senior leadership. And so all of a sudden, we see the Secretary of State, but we also see the Secretary of Navy Spence saying, no, the international, the Northwest Passage is an international strait, and we're going to fight for the right to show it. And you're just going, so you really want Russian and Chinese submarines to have the right of passage and their bombers to have the right of overflight? Because that's what you're saying. And so we've run into the situation that many of us think that the senior American leadership doesn't understand that, doesn't understand why it's in their own security interest not to do that. But we're seeing clear indications that, particularly if it's a Trump administration, they're going to push it again, that they're going to try to demonstrate that it's an international strait. And their argumentation will be, under international law, an international strait joins two international bodies of water, and it doesn't matter if there's ice or not ice. We've always said ice is important, makes a difference, but there isn't really that much international standing on it, and it has to be used from a functional perspective. And the Americans will say the two voyages in 1969, in 1985, when they went through the Northwest Passage without asking permission, demonstrates is enough. It's how many angels sit on the side of a pin. And so the Americans will argue that, but the terrifying part is if a Trump administration doesn't understand the security ramifications, as we saw Secretary of the Navy Spence, as we saw the Secretary of State, I'm blanking on his name right now.
Pompeo.
Yeah, Pompeo, making these statements, and you're shooting yourself in the foot. Why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. Anyway, but it gets into that illogicalness of the Trump administration and the lack of understanding. And so the big fear is that if Trump is reelected, he's going to turn around and say to the Coast Guard, you are going to go through there, and the hell with the 1988 agreement. And at that point, of course, okay, fine, Trump gets to make his point, but then the Chinese and the Russians get to go through. And so there is a real sovereignty issue that will be coming forward, probably if we do see a Trump victory in the coming American election.
Wow. Well, the question I now have for you is going back to some of the soft threats, I think you called them, in the Arctic, having to do with
soft security. I mean, they're real threats. I don't want to make it sound like it's a soft, not threat. No, right. But I want to talk about the government's reconciliation policies and how that helps or hurts Canada's ability to claim our Arctic sovereignty. So the federal government puts reconciliation at the top of a lot of its domestic policies, especially in the North. Is this something that you think actually bolsters Canada's sovereignty claims over the Arctic and helps us, or does it take away? Does it hinder that? It doesn't hinder, it doesn't hurt. It's a completely necessary requirement for the nation. I mean, the fact that we have the type of mental health crises and the other crises that we have in the North, the government absolutely needs to be doing the reconciliation, because, I mean, the statistics there are horrifying, to be honest. And so that is a point that the government needs to be applauded on, because they have made that central and they have made the efforts to improve on that side. But it has to be noted that in terms of sovereignty, the sovereignty is about the international shipping. And so the fact, unless we had an indigenous group that was somehow international, well, even domestically, you could just say, I mean, the bottom line is the government often confounds what the term sovereignty is all about. They'll say, okay, by putting more hospital capabilities in Yellowknife, we're protecting Canadian sovereignty. No, you're protecting Canadian security, health security. You're equaling your mandate of doing what you need to be doing, but you're not protecting Arctic sovereignty. You're not doing anything that is going to be showing that you are exercising complete control over the Northwest Passage, unless, of course, you're going to put a hospital in the middle of the waterway, which, of course, you're not going to do. But, I mean, these things are very important steps, and the government always tries to double hat by saying, okay, that shows we're doing meaningful sovereignty stuff. But really what they're doing is they're sidestepping it. They're saying, okay, see what we're doing. We're doing all this important stuff and we're meeting sovereignty. So they're like, no, you're not. You're meeting the basic needs of the population, and particularly the basic needs that you've allowed to deteriorate so badly of the northern indigenous peoples. And you need to, of course, be addressing that. But that doesn't give you a buy, because you can't turn around and say that that is somehow adding to our sovereignty unless you can convince the international community that somehow that asserts Canadian control over it. And of course, it doesn't.
Right. Last question I have for you, Professor, is looking forward. Do you have any expectation, as an expert in this area, that a change in federal government leadership will bring about a serious change in Canada's Arctic posture and our Arctic defense capabilities?
The change of government that will cause that will be the Trump administration. Once again, we know that historically speaking, be it conservative governments such as the Mulroney government, be it liberal governments such as the Pierre Trudeau administration, where they respond the most meaningfully is when the Americans do something. And so in the 1950s, the Americans were going to go ahead with or without us to respond to the Soviet threat. And so therefore we participated very fully in the placement of the DEW line and basically putting military capabilities in the Arctic region. In 1969, when the American icebreaker Manhattan went through the Northwest Passage, that forced Trudeau Sr. to develop a series of environmentally international progressive looking laws that gave us a functional control to a limited degree, not complete, and that's where the problem always relies. And of course, the Mulroney conservative government, it's when the American icebreaker Polar Sea goes through that we see one of the most meaningful Arctic policies developed. The Joe Clark announcement in September 10th in Parliament of what constitutes Canada's Arctic policy. So change of government doesn't matter for Canadian. In other words, we see a commonality of behavior from liberal and conservative governments throughout time of where they put their money. They inevitably are responding to American action. And so given the fact that we've already had a bit of a hint of what we can expect in the first administration of the Trump, the biggest changer would be, of course, in regards to a Trump administration. It would come in at least two impacts. It would come first and foremost, as I said, Trump seems to be determined it's just like when he said, I'm going to buy Greenland, which was, of course, a nonsensical northern policy. I think he probably misread a briefing that he got or misheard, when they're saying we have to do more with Greenland because we have a major base up at Thule. Well, it's no longer Thule. I'm always forgetting the new name. But anyway, we have a major important strategic base in that location. And so I think he misheard and said, well, let's just buy the damn place, and there are reasons to believe that's exactly how it is spelled out. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is if he's serious about pulling out of NATO, if the moment he does that, that is going to embolden a much more aggressive Russia, and it will probably also send a very dangerous sign to the Chinese, in which case you can see the Americans probably trying to pull back to an isolationist Pax North America, which means, of course, protecting the borders even more so, because if all of a sudden the Russians think that they have a free hand in Europe, in terms of where that's going to take in terms of war within Europe in that context, we can expect to see much more violence occurring. And so therefore, there'll be a pressure to say, okay, we have to make sure. Remember, he's already promising yesterday, we're going to have the best Iron Dome in the United States. Well, if you're going to have an Iron Dome, you got to protect all of North America. And so there will be tremendous pressure on Canada to make a much more meaningful contribution to NORAD in a much more dangerous international environment. And so those are the two forces I see, the sovereignty and the security side, that are going to bring tremendous pressure onto Canada if we see Trump elected.
Fascinating. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always my pleasure, Harrison. I look forward to next time.